She stood motionless. In the dim light of a stone corridor, her silhouette seemed like part of the wall itself. Shackles clung loosely to her ankles, more symbolic than secure, as if even iron no longer had the will to hold her. She had long since stopped struggling. Struggling led nowhere. It never had. No one remembered her name. She had been brought here as a possession, lost in a transaction of coin and silence. But those who passed her cell, guards, servants, nobles, couldn't help but glance, even if only for a second, not because of fear, not even pity, but because she had the kind of presence that made people feel like they'd just missed a page in a story they were meant to understand. Some said she was cursed. Others believed she was noble once, betrayed by her own. But the truth, as always, was quieter than the rumors. And it began far from here, in a city that valued gold above people. The city was called Aurelien, a coastal jewel of commerce, law, and pride, nestled between sea cliffs and merchant roads. In the year 1268, its markets hummed with silk and spices, but its silence echoed in back alleys and behind palace doors. Wealth, after all, had always had a way of buying silence. In Aurelien, lives were traded. Some climbed ladders built on contracts and dowries. Others were discarded like broken tools. And between these worlds walked one man. A merchant, born not to power, but to purpose. His name was Sir Edric Dorn, neither lord nor knight, yet respected by both. A man whose coin came from fair trade, not blood. He was known to dress modestly, speak rarely, and observe everything. He had seen things in ports and prisons that most nobles never dreamed of. And in all his travels, he never bought a slave. Until her. It was early spring when Edric entered the lower market. Rain still clung to the cobblestones, and the air smelled of salt and rust. He wasn't searching for anything, but sometimes the things that change us the most are not the things we seek. They are the ones that stop us mid-step, without reason. She sat against a post, hair matted, face unreadable. Her wrists were bound, but loosely. Her eyes were open, but looking nowhere. And for the first time in his life, Edric forgot to move. He simply stood and stared. Not in desire, not even curiosity, but in recognition. As if the pain she carried spoke a language he once knew and had tried to forget. The trader saw him pause. A good worker, he lied. Strong back. Quiet. Edric didn't respond. He walked forward, slow, thoughtful. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. How much? Edric asked, almost to himself. The answer was less than a bolt of linen, less than a dinner for 6, less than silence. Edric paid. He took her to the high quarter, but not to the grand houses or cold halls of nobility. His own home was modest. 2 stories, a courtyard with wild thyme, a kitchen that smelled of real bread, and a room upstairs with a window facing the harbor. She didn't speak for days. Not during meals, not during the evenings when he read by candlelight, not even when he left the door open. She was waiting. Not for him, but for the moment he would change, raise his voice, lock the door, make a demand. But it never came. Weeks passed. Then one morning, she asked for water. It was the first word she had spoken, and it wasn't just a word, it was a test. He passed. He poured the water and didn't ask questions. That day she told him his name. Alina. Strange things began to happen after that. The neighbors who once greeted Edric with calm nods now looked past him. The markets where he once traded freely became tighter, quieter. Even the city guards seemed to notice his footsteps. a man of reputation dealing with shadows, a respected trader dining with a slave. But Edric didn't care. He had found something he never sought and couldn't explain. She began to read, slowly at first, then quickly. He brought her scrolls, parchment, poems. She asked questions. He answered. And in the quiet between their conversations, something unspoken grew. Not infatuation, not gratitude, but something old, something neither of them could name. Still, not everyone looked away. There were whispers in the city's halls, in the merchant guilds, among the clergy, questions that hung in the air like perfume. What was she to him? What spell had she cast? And more importantly, what would he give up to keep her? Some say love begins in freedom, but theirs began in captivity, and somehow that made it feel even more real. But in a city like Aurelien, love was never private, and no one stays untouched by its price. Their story was only just beginning.
To understand her story, and his, we must understand the city that tried to silence them both. Aurelien, beautiful from the distance, terrifying up close. Its towers shone in the sun, casting shadows that fell like secrets over the cobbled streets. Ships docked daily with goods from across the known world, spices, silks, metals, glass. But for every deal struck in public, 2 more were whispered behind closed doors. This was not a city ruled by kings. It was ruled by coin. And coin had no memory, no conscience, no loyalty. It had once been a fishing port, centuries ago, simple and honest, but when salt gave way to silver, and silver to politics, Aurelien changed. Its people changed with it. Merchants became aristocrats, scribes became spies, priests became bankers. Trust faded, replaced by contracts, alliances, and sealed letters. By 1268, Aurelien was considered the safest place to store wealth and the most dangerous place to speak truth. Here, even kindness had a cost. It was in this city that Edric Dorn made his name. A man with no noble blood, no ancient family crest, just a mind that understood how silence worked. He built his trade slowly, refusing bribes, never taking favors, always watching. Some found him arrogant, others feared him. But none could deny his success. His house sat on the border between the merchant quarter and the scholar's hill. Not poor, not opulent, just distant enough from both worlds to belong to neither. It was here that he brought Alina, still silent, still unreadable. The neighbors did not question him, not at first. Respect kept their tongues still. But the city noticed. Aurelien always noticed. They watched from behind curtains, through lattice windows, behind market stalls. The girl who never spoke, the man who never explained. Rumors grew, like ivy on old stone. Some believed she was his mistress. Others thought she was cursed, a witch, perhaps, or a foreign spy. But the city did what it always did best. It said nothing out loud. Aurelien had a strange rhythm. Mornings were busy, afternoons were calculated, nights were quiet, too quiet. At dusk, shutters closed before the bells rang, not because of crime, but because of fear. Not of thieves, but of listeners. Walls had ears, Gardens, too. Even fountains were said to carry whispers to rival estates. This was the city Alina was brought into, not as a guest, not yet as a prisoner, somewhere in between. She spent days looking through the window, watching the harbor lights. Boats came and went, but none ever for her. She didn't ask questions, but her silence asked them anyway. Who was she really? And why had Edric, a man known for his distance, let her so close? Edric didn't speak of it, not to her, not to friends, he had few, not to the city council, where he once held a quiet seat in trade affairs. But he knew the silence around her would not last forever. And he was right. The first to visit was a priest, thin, aged, smiling too much. He came with books for her mind, he said, but his eyes studied everything, the shelves, the dishes, even her posture. Then came a cousin from the lower docks, loud, talkative, bearing wine. He stayed too long, laughed too loudly, left with questions. And then the letters began. Anonymous, folded neatly, pressed with no seal. She didn't read them. Edric burned each one without opening. But the city was speaking now, just not with words. Every city has its own kind of magic. In Aurelien, it was the magic of forgetting. People forgot names, faces, debts, even crimes, but they never forgot a deviation from the pattern, and Edric had become a deviation. In the evenings, Alina started to walk the courtyard. Not far, just small loops between the thyme and ivy. She wore plain clothes, her hair loose, eyes thoughtful. The servants, though few, gave her space. One night, a boy in the street called her a name she didn't recognize. When she turned, he ran. She never spoke of it, but her walks grew shorter after that. Something was tightening around them. Not a noose, not yet, but a circle. One afternoon, an old woman stopped Edric in the market. "She dreams," the woman whispered. "Be careful. Some dreams don't stay in sleep." He didn't respond, but the words followed him home. That evening, Alina stood by the harbor window holding one of his books. "Why are all the stories written by men?" she asked. He smiled, a rare thing. "Because men feared what women would write." She nodded, then closed the book. Even in the quietest cities, stories find their voice, sometimes in letters, sometimes in rumors, sometimes in the eyes of a girl who used to be silent. And though no one dared to say it aloud, the question was rising like the tide. What happens when a man like Edric Dorn protects something the city wants to forget? And what happens when she no longer wants to stay hidden?
People said he bought her. They whispered it in taverns, scribbled it in letters, muttered it behind closed shutters. To them it was a transaction, a man of status taking in a nameless girl from the lower markets. That was how Aurelien made sense of things, through coin, through purpose, through advantage. But what happened between Edric and Alina was never a matter of gold. It was something else, something no contract could measure. It began with silence, not just hers, but his too. In those first days, they existed like shadows in the same space, passing one another, never touching. She would wake early,
walk the halls barefoot, and vanish before breakfast. He would return late from the docks, his coat damp from the sea, his eyes searching but never pressing. He didn't ask her to serve him, didn't assign duties, didn't claim gratitude. He simply gave her a room and let her be. That alone was a shock. For someone who had lived most of her life being moved, commanded, contained, Alina didn't know what to do with stillness, with freedom that felt unfinished. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't fear either. Edric, for his part, remained patient. It wasn't strategy. He wasn't waiting for her to break or bloom. He just watched, as if trying to remember something long forgotten about himself. It was this balance between attention and restraint that made something begin to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. One rainy evening, she found a book in the common room, thin, worn, with verses in old dialect. She turned the pages carefully, unsure why her hands shook. He came in quietly, saw her holding it. "That was my mother's," he said. She froze, but didn't put it down. He didn't ask her to. Instead, he sat across from her and lit a candle. That was the beginning. From then on, she stayed longer in the evenings, not speaking, just sitting. He would read aloud, sometimes from trade records, sometimes poetry. She didn't always understand, but she listened, and every time she sat a little closer to the flame. They began to exchange small words, not stories, not memories, just things like, "The bread is too hard," "The rain came early," "I saw a cat in the ivy." None of it mattered, and somehow all of it did. There was a night when the wind howled through the shutters and the sea crashed like thunder in the bay. She woke from sleep and crept to the common room, thinking he might have forgotten to latch the door. He was already there. He looked at her as one looks at a ghost they don't fear. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. And for the first time, she believed him. But even as something quiet and good began to grow between them, the world outside began to sharpen. Merchants who once greeted Edric now ignored him. His invitations to city council meetings slowed. At first, he thought it was coincidence. It wasn't. His name was being erased softly. She noticed too. Fewer candles were delivered. The baker raised his price. A friend of Edric's crossed the street rather than wave. Alina wanted to speak of it, but the fear of causing harm by naming it held her tongue. Still, one morning, she brought him tea and asked, "Would you still have bought me if no one was watching?" He looked at her then, more seriously than ever before. "I didn't buy you," he said. "I freed you." She nodded slowly and said nothing more. But she smiled, not out of joy, but out of relief, as if she had waited for those words to exist, as if they made her real. In the weeks that followed, they built habits, quiet rituals. A loaf of bread shared on the stairs. A coin flipped to decide who would stoke the fire. A game of guessing the ships in the harbor by their sails. It looked like friendship, but beneath it, something older stirred. Something that neither of them dared to name.
Of course, people watched. They always did. From alleys, from balconies, from behind the robes of church officials. A respected merchant eating with a girl once branded property. It was unthinkable, and yet it was happening. What frightened the city wasn't scandal. It was proof. Proof that the boundaries they built between worth and worthlessness could be undone quietly, without permission, and that love, in its gentlest form, had no need for law. Some said Edric had gone mad. Others said he was under a spell. But the truth was simpler. He had never believed he was better than anyone, and Alina had never asked for anything but truth. In that they met, not as merchant and slave, but as people. But still, even the deepest truths make shallow ripples when the world refuses to see them. And Aurelien, for all its wealth, was blind to what didn't serve it. Their bond was not a scandal, it was a threat. And one night, as rain returned to the streets and the harbor lights flickered, a sealed letter arrived at Edric's door. The seal was black. The message inside was short, but it would change everything.
At first, the whispers were easy to ignore. They came as passing glances in the market, as hesitant pauses in conversation, as names left out of invitations. A city like Aurelien never shouted its judgment. It whispered it into the cracks of the walls, into the folds of fabric, into the ink of unsigned letters. Edric had lived long enough among its silence to know the difference between being noticed and being watched. Now, he was being watched. It had been weeks since the black-sealed letter arrived. Its words were few, no threat, no demand, only a question written in a careful hand. "What are you doing, Edric?" He burned it, like the others, but unlike the others, he remembered it. The timing was not accidental. His name had quietly disappeared from guild rosters. Two merchants who once called him partner had closed their accounts. A shipment from the eastern docks had been delayed, then lost, then forgotten. It was as though he was being erased, not by law, but by intention. And in the halls of power, silence could be louder than any decree. The city council chambers had once welcomed Edric as a steady, neutral voice. He never spoke more than needed. He refused bribes and detested spectacle. His peers admired his clarity until clarity began to look like dissent. Now, when he entered the great marble corridor, conversations hushed. A cough would echo. A glance would linger. His footsteps felt heavier than before. He sat in the back row, listened, measured. When they spoke of commerce, he heard undertones of control. When they debated safety, he heard fear. And when they discussed civic harmony, he heard the weight of his own name, unspoken but not absent. At home, the tension crept like ivy. Alina had become part of the rhythm of the house, moving gracefully, thoughtfully, never loudly. She still asked few questions, but now her eyes followed him longer when he returned late. She noticed when he opened a letter and said nothing. She began leaving notes beside his tea. Small questions, soft sentences, nothing pressing. But they marked something undeniable. She cared. And he didn't know whether that made things easier or harder. One evening, a councilman named Thorn came to visit. He arrived without a servant, without a carriage, without a smile. He spoke as one who had practiced every word.
Your absence has been noted. There are concerns. I offered him wine. Thorn refused. Concerns about influence, about loyalty, about perception. Edric looked him in the eye. She is no threat. Thorn didn't nod, didn't disagree. He only stood. You've done much for this city. Don't let it unmake you. And then he left. After that, the whispers grew teeth. The baker delivered burned loaves. A neighbor's wall accidentally collapsed onto their garden. A clerk at the harbor denied him paperwork, only to apologize too late. These weren't crimes. They were reminders. Aurelien didn't exile. It isolated. In this atmosphere, Alina became quieter still. But her silence was different now. Not submission, not caution. Preparation. She began walking the edges of the city, the old walls, the neglected towers, the forgotten paths to the scholars' quarter. She asked for books on local history. She traced family crests. She listened in the libraries more than she read. Edric noticed, but he didn't ask. Sometimes love means not asking. Sometimes it means waiting. One night, she stood beside him by the harbor. "The people here," she said, "do not believe anyone can change." He looked at her. "And you?" She hesitated. "I think they fear those who already have." In the council chambers, there were now new topics on the agenda. Not trade, not defense, but decorum, stability, keeping the old ways. It sounded noble, but it wasn't. Behind these words was a target, one not named but known. A man who had broken a rule no one dared write down. He had loved someone the city had already discarded. Some whispered he had lost his mind. Others wondered if he had been blackmailed, but most quietly felt something colder. Envy. Because he had done what they did not dare. He had chosen someone without power, and she had looked back at him without fear. Even among the stone halls of Aurelien's power, that look of mutual recognition was the most dangerous thing of all, because it reminded them of something the city had worked centuries to erase, that love, freely given, had once built this place, and could unmake it too. Then came the summons, hand-delivered, simple, direct. Appear before the civic council, sundown. No accusation, no crime, just an invitation. But everyone knew what it meant. It was not a question, it was a test, and everyone would be listening.
Some promises are whispered, not declared. Some are sealed with silence, not ink. And some are made beneath the branches of a tree no one else notices, where the world, for a moment, forgets to listen. This is where they went when they could no longer speak freely. To the edge of Aurelien, to the garden that time forgot, to the willow that bent low, as if it knew how heavy their secrets had grown. It was not escape. It was agreement. It was the beginning of something neither of them had the language for. The summons to the civic council arrived on a Monday. Edric read it twice, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. It was polite as always, no accusation, no threat, just a time, a room, a seat with his name on it. He didn't tell Alina right away. Instead, he walked the city. From the merchant quarter down to the silent docks, past the statues of forgotten founders, Aurelien had never looked so old to him, so fragile beneath its grandeur. He watched men in robes speak of balance, while boys fought over scraps near the river. He thought of all the things he had tried not to see. Then he returned home and told her. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. The garden had no official name. It sat behind the disused monastery, once a place of reflection, now a ruin of ivy and birdsong. They had found it weeks before, by chance. A wrong turn, a narrow gate, a path half claimed by moss. At its center stood the willow, not large, not ancient, but shaped in such a way that its branches formed a private room of green, soft and hidden from the world. That evening they returned. She walked ahead, he followed. They didn't speak until the city was only a hum in the distance. "If I go," he said, "I may not come back unchanged." Alina sat on a root, fingers brushing the grass. "If you don't go," she replied, "they'll write your absence louder than your presence." Silence. "Then, do you regret it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "I regret waiting so long to choose what mattered." She looked up, and for the first time her voice was not quiet. "Then choose again, now, here." Under the willow they made no vows. They signed no parchment, there was no audience. Only two people, surrounded by leaves, saying with their eyes what others write in laws. That what they had was not a transaction, not rebellion, not shame. It was a truth that could not be erased by rumor or law or time. A truth that once spoken aloud demanded to be lived. He took her hand, not with possession, but with presence. She didn't pull away. Instead, she whispered, "If they take you, I will not follow." He nodded. "And if they silence me," he said, "you must not remain quiet." The pact was not about staying together. It was about staying true. The next day, Edric prepared. Not his defense, he had no intention of justifying love, but his words. He dressed in gray, no insignia, no jewelry, no crest. He left his ring on the windowsill. Alina stood at the doorway. She didn't cry, but her fingers were clenched, white against the frame. Return not unchanged, but unbroken. He gave no promise, but she saw it in his eyes. Rumors say they were seen that morning, near the willow, that someone heard a song, soft, unrecognizable, drifting from the trees. Some believe it was an oath. Others say it was a farewell. But those who truly knew Edric Dorn and the woman called Alina, they say it was both. And from that moment forward, whenever the willow tree bloomed, the petals fell in twos, as if the tree remembered, even when the city did not.
There are moments when time doesn't stop, but softens. When the world moves, but quietly. And when fate speaks not with thunder, but with absence. It was during such a moment that Edric Dorn stepped through the high arch of the civic hall as the sun dipped behind Aurelien's towers. He didn't know if he was walking into judgment or something worse. He only knew he had to go. The council chamber was colder than he remembered, not in temperature, but in presence. A circle of stone, seats elevated just enough to remind the speaker where they stood. Faces that had once greeted him with quiet respect now turned deliberately neutral. Not cruel, not warm, just untouched. No charges were read, no crimes listed. A bell rang, and the questions began. What is your relationship to the woman known as Alina? Edric stood straight. She lives under my roof.
That is not an answer. It is the only one I'll give. Whispers, then silence. Do you deny that you have endangered public order by harboring someone of unknown origin? I deny that love endangers order. Longer silence. Some shifted in their chairs. Someone scribbled something, but no one met his eyes. Meanwhile, across the city, Alina waited. Not pacing, not hiding. She sat in the small upstairs room, window open, breeze stirring the curtain. A single candle flickered beside her. In her lap, a folded piece of paper, written that morning, just in case he didn't return. She hadn't cried. She had already done that once years ago when she thought no one would ever see her again. This time was different. This time she believed someone might remember. The questioning continued. Do you understand the precedent this sets? Yes, Edric said. It sets one I believe in. Then you leave us no choice. Still no verdict. Still no decision. Only pauses long enough for the silence to deepen. And then came the final question. Soft, from a younger voice, a junior clerk. Do you believe she loves you? It wasn't a trap. It was curiosity. The room held its breath. Edric's reply was slow, quiet. I believe she never had the chance not to. They let him leave. No punishment, no exoneration, just silence. And that silence followed him through the halls, down the steps, into the street where no one met his eyes, as if the city had spoken its verdict in the only way it knew, with distance. He returned home at dusk. The candle was still lit. She was still there. They didn't embrace, they didn't speak, but something passed between them. Not relief, not victory, recognition of a threshold crossed and a world that would not welcome them the same again. In the days that followed, Aurelien returned to normal. Markets reopened, bells rang, trade resumed, but Edric's name was never spoken in council again. His client slowly faded, his position dissolved, not with force, but with omission. And yet, people noticed. Not everyone looked away. A scribe from the Western Academy sent a book with no note. A child left flowers near their gate. Even a retired merchant, once his rival, stopped him at the corner and whispered, I would have done the same if I'd had the courage. But courage rarely echoes, and fate does not always announce itself. Sometimes it speaks in the space between moments, in the hesitation before a door opens, in the silence after a truth is spoken. And for Edric and Alina, fate had spoken, not in chains, not in trials, but in what the city chose not to say, and what they, at last, refused to hide.
Some stories end in silence, others become silence. But a rare few, echo long after the voices fall away. They live in places, not pages, in glances, in stones, and in the spaces where names used to be spoken. Years passed. Aurelien did not fall, it did not burn, it did not change in any grand, visible way. It simply continued, the way cities do when they have learned to forget quietly,
The council still met, the bells still rang, ships still came and went, but for those who watched closely, small absences began to appear. A merchant's seat left permanently empty, a house in the scholars' quarter that grew vines without interference, a ledger closed without signature, and beneath it all, a name no longer said aloud, but never quite erased. Edric Dawn was not seen again in the public square, but he had not left. He had simply stepped into a different kind of life, one with fewer doors, but fewer masks. He and Alina lived quietly, not hidden, not celebrated, simply present, like breath, like shadow, like warmth in the winter stone. She began writing, not for others, for herself. At first fragments, then stories, then questions turned into prose. She never published them, but sometimes pages would be found tucked inside borrowed books at the local library, written in her hand, always unsigned. The willow still stood. Visitors came rarely, but when they did, they always spoke softer beneath its branches. A place like that demands it. Something about the way the leaves fell in spirals, or the way the roots curled toward one another, as if remembering two people who once made a promise here. Locals began to say the tree was lucky. Lovers tied small strings to the lower branches. Children whispered into the bark. A few even claimed that when the wind passed through, it sounded like voices, not ghostly, but gentle, as if the tree was still listening. Not everyone remembered the scandal. Most never even knew. But now and then someone would pause at the edge of the street near the old house, hand resting on the gate, as if recalling something they never lived. They'd stand there for a moment, and then continue on, without knowing why they'd stopped. Because echoes don't always return as sound. Sometimes they return as knowing. In time, the city changed. Not quickly, not loudly, but slowly. It began with small things. A servant invited to speak at a forum, a girl from the docks winning a poetry prize, a merchant's son marrying a woman with no family name. No one connected these things, not officially, but under it all a story lived, not told, but remembered. And one day, in a new archive beneath the rebuilt academy, a young historian found a sealed scroll tucked into a hollow panel. It bore no title. Inside, a single sentence, written in faded ink, read aloud only once, but never forgotten. Some truths are not meant to survive history, only to change those who hear them. That was all, but it was enough, because every story, even those lost, leaves something behind. A gesture, a silence, a root, or a name once whispered beneath the leaves of a tree that never forgot. And the city? It listens differently now, even in its quiet.